Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another session of ENG4E Term 2A, brought to you by WASA Distance Education Center. I am your instructor, Mike Laverty. Today is February 21st, 2023, and we are on to Unit 2 of our class. So class number 9, we're going to delve into Unit 2, and we're going to look at key questions 22 through 24, right? So key questions 22, 23, and 24. And we are, throughout this unit, we'll be discussing our novel, Where the Rivers Meet. So I'll be moving ahead with the discussion of the novel that we're studying for this course. So I will be discussing the plot of the novel, so there will be spoilers. So I recommend that you read the novel as soon as possible. It's the only way to answer the questions and to write your culminating assignment. So more on that later, but yeah, make sure you've got a start on that novel at the very least. So we are in week number 3 of classes in Term 2A. We will have 9 weeks in total. March break is from March 13th to the 16th, so there'll be no classes, no broadcasts. I'll be on vacation. And if you have the time, that's a perfect opportunity for you to catch up on your assignments, get as much work done as you possibly can. I won't be available to you, like to answer questions and to help you through stuff. I will be off work during that time. But we're back again for, I believe, 3 more weeks after that to get you ready for the final exam. And if you're on Facebook, I suggest that you join the WASA Facebook page. So lots of good information for you about WASA in general, give you updates on some key information coming your way, some key dates, especially if you plan on graduating or if you want to know what courses are being taught, if there's any plans for doing courses over the summer, for example. So just lots of things like that. So we took care of Unit 1 during weeks 1 and 2 of the course. Now, Unit 2, since we have to cover the novel, I'm hoping we can take care of this during weeks 3 and 4. I'm hoping that we can that'll happen. There's a lot of material to cover. I don't want to skip over it, so this might go a bit into week 5, but if I can, I'm hoping that we can spend 2 weeks on each unit. So ENG4E is broadcast live Monday through Thursday from 2 to 2:55. Sorry, I should say 2:50. 2 to 2:50 p.m. Central Standard Time every Monday to Thursday. You can phone the studio at 1-800-465-7144 or 737-4017. Tuning in on 91.9 FM. Listening on Bell ExpressVu, channel 972. And if you go to zoom.us and you type in that whole URL, or if you just type in the meeting ID or the meeting code, it is 417-6699799. Check out Laverty Wasa on YouTube. As of tomorrow morning, you will see classes 1 through 9 of ENG4E will be on there. So almost about a third of our courses will be on there. There. And so those are listed by playlist. So you'll see a Term 2A Unit 1 playlist, a Term 2A, which is every class, and then starting tomorrow, you'll see an ENG4E Unit 2 playlist. So all of the videos that cover stuff in Unit 2 will be in one playlist. So just a friendly reminder to send me your assignments, get your work into me as soon as you can. Talk to your DEC if you need any help with submitting your assignments, especially if you need tech help. They can help you with scanning, emailing, faxing. So there's many ways you can get work to your teachers. If you have the ability and the technology at home or in the office, you can email your work to studentwork@nnec.on.ca and mlaverty@nnecschools.org. You can also take photos with your phone and just send that over to me, but you got to make sure that I can read it and it's legible and I can print it off on my end, but again, you have to make sure that it's readable. And that's why I recommend using the Adobe Scan app. It's a free app you can put in your phone. Makes it really easy to get high quality scans. All right. So, excuse me. I do recommend that you give me work in groups of, say, 5 to 10 assignments. It allows me to provide you with feedback quickly and guide your future work. So, or for example, you might want to send in your culminating activity. So a batch of like 5 to 10 is like the ideal range, but if you just want to hand in one, I'm fine with that. Or one large activity. And be sure to write down your name, your community, your course code, and assignment information. So just give me as much info as you can, and there won't be any mistakes there. So this is how to reach me. So mlaverty@nnecschools.org. Hit me up on Facebook, Laverty Wassa. And please phone the Wassa office, 807-737-1488 if you have any questions. If you want to talk to me, ask for Mike or dial extension 2211. Here's our 2 weeks suggested progress. So after 2 weeks of taking this course, you should have made contact with your teacher, read the study guide, Unit 2 and Unit 1 of ENG4E, read chapters 1 to 3 of Where the Rivers Meet. So I believe there's 15 chapters in total, so it's a lot of reading. So I, at the very least, have 1 to 3 read at this point. And have key questions 1 through 15 from Unit 1 taken care of. So we're going to look at our images of the day. We're going to review key questions 22. That's vocabulary development. And key question 24, chapter reflections. And we're going to have a look at the guided reading questions from key question 23, chapters 1 through 3. So when you look at key question 23, there are guided reading questions for every chapter of the book. So I would suggest to you would be, after you read a chapter and that chapter is fresh inside your mind, that's the time to answer those guided reading questions. Don't read the whole book and then go back and answer those questions. I personally, I would read chapter 1 and then answer the guided reading questions on chapter 1. Like after every chapter, or even better, you could read those chapters before you read you could read the questions to yourself and then read the chapter, and then you'll really know how to answer them. Our learning goals are to identify the elements of narrative in our novel, Where the Rivers Meet. So last week, I introduced that term, the elements of narrative, and that's found in our textbook. And the elements of narrative we talked about were narrative itself, who tells the story, how they tell it, the settings, the character, the plot, the theme, the conflict, right? So these are the elements of narrative, right? So we're going to look at how those apply to where the rivers meet, and that's going to give us ways that we can talk about the novel, okay? So there's not a lot of key questions in Unit 2, but the questions ask you to write and read a lot, right? So there's definitely less questions, but the questions are more challenging. So for example, when you're reflecting and when you're responding to a chapter, so you can pick any 6 chapters from the book and you can write about any 6 chapters, but when you do that, when you respond to the chapter, I'm hoping that you can use these elements of fiction, and you can talk about specific parts of the book. And so, step 1, what are the elements of narrative? Step 2, how are they expressed in this book? And then step 3 is like taking a closer look at like one of those elements. And we'll carefully consider key questions 22, 23, and 24. And your success criteria is responding to those key questions after doing a close reading of the first 3 chapters of Where the Rivers Meet, right? So you will read your unit material, review everything in there, read the chapters of the book, take notes during this class, and then all of that will culminate as you complete those key questions. All right, so for today's images of the day, and for those who are just listening on the radio or otherwise, I'll use my descriptive powers here to let you know what you're looking at here, right? So our novel, Where the Rivers Meet, takes place in British Columbia. And as far as I can tell, Creighton is not a real town in British Columbia, but there are lots of rivers with that same name, and I think there's a Creighton Valley, so it's like that name is used quite a bit. But so Creighton is the town where Nancy, our protagonist, goes to school. So there's actually the reserve on Creighton, and then there's the town itself. And so it's sort of like these 2 different worlds, right? So she has to leave her reserve, cross the bridge, go into town, take her classes, and then she goes back every night to her home, right? So we've just got a kind of a panoramic shot of British Columbia with the rolling mountains, the green mountains, with little towns nestled in amongst huge rivers and lakes, and similar to Ontario, but definitely a different kind of ecology, different kinds of trees. A lot, we don't have the Rocky Mountains. Yeah, so she lives in a small town, and the book is published in 1988. So I'm assuming the events of the novel are taking place around that similar time, like mid to late 80s. So I myself was born in the early 80s. So it's around the time of my childhood, but it's a time before the internet, before technology really takes over the life of teenagers and young people. They do play video games at an arcade in this book, but that's about it. The characters in the book don't really interact with technology in any kind of meaningful way. It's definitely from a different time period, right? It makes me feel old to say that, but yeah, it's the early to late 80s. It's a different time. The book it deals with residential schools and the trauma that people experienced in those schools. Not directly. Nancy visits an abandoned residential school, but her father went to one, and her mother, and it's really affected their life. So this book is kind of ahead of its time, I think, especially for a novel meant for high school students to be talking about issues such as residential schools and racism and small town life. So it's, and then up on the screen, I've also got a picture of a railway bridge. So, the story is called Where the Rivers Meet, and the railway bridge is a constant image in the book. Uh, many important things happen in or around the bridge. It's a symbol, but it's also a very real physical, part of the landscape that is very important to the story. So, yeah, so basically, it's a story about a young woman living in a small town, and we have, the story pops you right into one day of her life, and we realize that things are, they're not great in her life, and she does have a couple of friends she can talk to. She's living with her dad, and things get worse for her for sure as the book plays out. But at the start of the book, you wouldn't exactly call her, like just happy with life as it is, right? She seems to have a lot of problems with the town that she grows up in, right? She perceives a lot of injustice and oppression, and things are not going well, and especially for her people, the Shuswap people. So she feels there's a lot of racism in the town, and as you read the book, you see that that's not only her perception, that is the reality of living in Creighton. It seems like there's a lot of racism, there's a lot of negativity, and as a young woman who's about to graduate high school, I think I can relate to being 17, being on the edge of graduation, and just having this like restlessness feeling and wanting to do something important and wanting to change the world, but at the same time you still feel like you're still a kid, but you're not. So it's the classic kind of um, it's a coming of age story, and I'll touch upon that in a few slides. But it's really about the transformation of one person, right? Because it's a story about a town and all the people who live there. But of course, Nancy Antoine, or Antoine, I'm not sure. Antoine is that's our main character, and it's really about her. So last week we talked about making an outline for our assignment, and so just looking at how we could create an outline and then make a story that way. So this way we're sort of doing the opposite, right? So instead of creating a whole bunch of things, we're putting things into a category, right? So the book has been written, it's already done. Our job is not to write the book. Our job is to read the book and 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 not just read the book, but to analyze it and to do a close reading of something. And one of the easiest way to do this is to simply start putting the book into categories, right? So like narrative, and I'll touch upon this as we go along, but it's a third person limited. So Nancy and she, but more on that in a second. So the characters, who are the characters in this story? We've got Nancy, of course. We've got George. We've got her dad. We've got the teachers. The setting is, of course, Creighton, British Columbia, small town. The plot, the conflict, and the theme. So, not much to. I'll do the short version here, actually. So, I would say the plot is like Nancy struggling to graduate. The conflict of the story would be, the things that get in her way. This is the really short version. I've said it much better in a later slide. And the theme, we've got growing up, change, and justice. But like the biggest distinction between conflict and theme and plot and all that is, plot is simply what happens in the story, right? So the plot of a story is just what happens, the order it's listed. That's a plot, right? A plot is just scene, scene, scene after scene, right? It's just simply what happens. Now, the theme of a piece of writing, it goes deeper than that, right? It's what is really happening, right? So there's always like a surface story, a bunch of stuff is happening, right? But there's always a deeper meaning, and it's sort of like when you read poetry, or when you look at like abstract art, or like a lot of paintings in general, right? So like, sure, it's a painting of an eagle flying over a lake, but is there a deeper story here, right? Is there, like, so the plot is like surface, and conflict and theme they run a little bit deeper, and you have to kind of think about them a little more. And conflict keeps the plot moving, right? But the theme is like the deeper messaging. All right, so I mentioned that Where the Rivers Meet is a third person limited. So narrative is who tells the story and how they tell it. So we have third person limited. So the narrator is the one telling the story. So when you flip open a book, a novel, when you flip open any novel, any work of fiction, somebody is telling you a story, okay? And if they use the I voice, like, I'm going to tell you a story, that's first person, right? So first person is I. Third person is when I say somebody else's name, or I use pronouns like her and she, etc., things like that. So that's what it means to talk in the third person. Because the narrator talks about Nancy, talks about George, her friend, talks about Mr. Grebs, the man who runs the grocery store. We talk about her friend George, right? So that's the third person. Now it's limited because we only get to hear about Nancy's inner thoughts and world, right? So here's a quote from the book. She studied the water as it boiled through the gorge. It moved with urgency, pulsing and rushing like the blood in her own veins. So basically, everything we read in this book is Nancy's thoughts, right? Unless it's a conversation between two people. because then we're getting other people's thoughts and words. But every word of this book that's not a quotation from somebody else is her thoughts. You're getting her thoughts, but it's still written in third person. So there's third person limited, and then there's what we call third person omniscient. So omni means everything. And this part means knowledge. Kind of a similar word to like sentience. So we you can use this God, you can say God is omnipotent, and if you're omnipotent, you have every power. If you're omniscient, you have knowledge of everything, right? Our narrator is not omniscient, it's limited. So it doesn't have knowledge of everything. Our narrator doesn't know what everybody's thinking, but our narrator does know what Nancy is thinking. What if this book were written in the first person? So here's an example. I could feel the bridge shudder as the river crashed and swirled around the rocks. She could feel the bridge shudder as the river crashed and swirled around the rocks. I shook my head to try to clear the old memory. Nancy shook her head to try to clear the old memory. So you see how the story doesn't change, and what's happening in the story doesn't change, but the perspective changes. And by having this written as a third person limited, we're a little bit removed from Nancy. We're not getting the I said this, I thought that. So there's like a little bit of distance between us and Nancy. But that being said, we still get to hear her thoughts directly. And when you're reading the book, just keep that in mind. You are reading Nancy's thoughts. This is her inner world that you're experiencing. All right, so the setting. It's a small town in Creighton, British Columbia. That's an excerpt from the very first paragraph of the book. And I'll read that for you now. The railroad trestle lay across the canyon like a web strung between two enormous rocks. Far below the wooden beams of the trestle, the gorge was choked with water boiling between the steep sides. A constant low roar climbed up the mountain walls. Jagged snow-tipped peaks rose on either side of the river like rows of gigantic wolves' teeth. So so the author has started the book off with setting, right? So they're starting with a description of the landscape. But it's also important to realize that this is Nancy's. This is how Nancy sees her world, right? So you've got the railway looks like a web, like a spider's web, like meant to capture things. You got a constant low roar up the mountainside. The water is boiling. Nancy looks to the mountains, and she sees the snow-capped peaks, and she sees rows of wolves' teeth. Right, so you could argue that Nancy looks around her world, and she sees. And I would argue she feels a bit threatened by the world around her, and she doesn't quite feel stable, and that may have to do with the fact that she's standing in the middle of the bridge on this little tiny platform, and if a train were to go by, it'd be very scary for her. And then we also learn that this bridge has been the source of suicides in her community, and people have died not just by suicide, but just kind of about being in the wrong spot at the wrong time. And so Nancy feels very passionate about this bridge. She knows it's dangerous, but that's our setting, right? And then if we flip the page over, we have this description of the two rivers meeting each other. So the name of the book is Where the Rivers Meet, and that's of course where she lives is where these two rivers meet. One river is bigger than the other, and they kind of meet in this, and things get very choppy and right. So that's important to keep in mind, right? So it's definitely a novel about place, right? So I think setting is very important in this story, and it's something that you might want to talk about in your chapter reflections. Like, how does setting affect the story? How does Nancy see her world? And I'm just making connections back to our culminating assignment from last term. How does Nancy shape the world? How is the world shaping Nancy? What kind of a person is Nancy when the book opens? What kind of a person is she when the book closes, right? But it all takes place somewhere, and in some books setting is more important than others, and I would say that in this book setting seems to be of the utmost importance. So if we're thinking about British Columbia, Nancy is from she identifies as a Shuswap First Nations person. So that territory, it's like a lot of indigenous territories, it doesn't necessarily follow the provincial lines, right? So Shuswap territory is actually in BC and Alberta, and it straddles two river systems. So you got the Columbia and the Fraser. In the book, they have Shuswap names, but the author may have been thinking about these two big rivers, the Fraser and the Columbia. And then we see, so there actually is, and you saw in that region from the previous map, right? So, in the middle of Shuswap territory is a lake called Shuswap Lake, and there's Vernon, Kelowna, Kamloops. So we don't really know specifically where Nancy's reserve is, where Creighton is. But I would argue that it's somewhere near there, right? It's near Kamloops, near Vernon. It's in that lower central British Columbia, right? So, it's going to be somewhere in there. All right, the characters of the book. So we have Nancy Antoine. We have her friends, George and Barry. She lives with her father. There's several other students mentioned at her high school. Later on in the story, we meet Mrs. Smith. She's the elder. We don't read about her until like the last half of the book, at least, maybe even further, right? So we have a host of characters. With Nancy being, of course, the most important one. We've got teachers, we've got Quigley, we've got the school staff. The secretary is the interesting first name of Donut. Donut Stevenson. That's our principal. We've got Quigley, who Nancy is constantly bickering with. We have some other adults in the story. We've got Mr. Grebs. Um, yeah, I'm just flipping through the first chapter where she has her first argument with Quigley. And then there's Bernice Wu, the home ec teacher who Nancy has a good connection with, right? So, um, let's see, we've got Mark Bateman. You got Nancy's cousin. Right, so we've got a young woman who, and so she's got the friends at her high school. These two guys are older. They've either dropped out or graduated. And you sort of get the sense that she's close to, she's close to George, close to Barry, but she's not dating either one of them. But she is close to them, and they are very close friends for her, and they're very supportive of her. All right, so we've got narrative, we've got a setting, we have our characters, we've got our plot. So in the wake of several traumatic events that affect people close to her, Nancy is struggling to focus on graduating high school in her final year. After hitting a breaking point, she decides to get help and connects with an elder that she's known since childhood. The plot of this novel covers Nancy's attempt to do something, maybe anything, meaningful to change her town. Before she can do that, Nancy ... So that's basically the plot. It's a young girl, a young woman, I should say. She wants to graduate high school, but there's a whole bunch of trauma happening in her life. She hits a breaking point, and then she has to get help. So that's really the plot of the novel. It's her trying to graduate high school, trying to change herself. But before she can do that, she has to, the plot has to happen, right? Now, conflict. Now, I identified a few conflicts here. So, Nancy's struggling to graduate high school while grieving the death of her friend. I put friend twice there. Right? So that's a huge conflict, right? She's trying to graduate high school. She's barely keeping herself together. And then one of her friends dies. Nancy's belief in the injustice faced by her people against her inability to do anything about it for now. So that's a huge conflict in her life. Nancy saying that she wants to leave her hometown of Creighton and saying she wants to change it somehow. Right? So she both wants to change the community and she wants to get out of it. Right? So that's a conflict. Nancy's constant conflict with the staff at her high school. Right? So like a lot of good books, novels, plays, TV shows, there's not necessarily one conflict that runs through the whole book. There's going to be many, many conflicts, some of them more important than others. But I would say that the top one is probably the most important, right? She's struggling to graduate high school, and at the start of the book, she's just simply doing that. She's struggling to graduate. And then, after the death of one of her closest friends, that's when the conflict is kind of raised to a different, the stakes are kind of raised, right? And so conflict comes in different forms, and, but there's probably, like a primary one that's leading the whole story. And then theme, this is what I would call a coming-of-age story. The main character, Nancy, is growing up maybe a bit too fast based on her life up to this point, arguably. And she's becoming an adult, a woman. There is a main theme of personal transformation. So that's what I think is the main theme here, is that's that main theme, that's that deeper level. It's a personal transformation. And it's one that Nancy makes by confronting her past and continual meditation, right? And you know her sweats and her her spirit quest or whatever you want to call it. And there's also the sub theme of fighting injustice that runs throughout the novel. Nancy's transformation is completed when she finally acts on her own words to make a stand against some powerful forces, right? So I would say the main theme is personal transformation and changing who you are and confronting your past. I would say that's the main theme, but this theme of fighting injustice and standing up for what's right is another theme. I called it a sub theme. It's not as important as the main one, but they are closely connected. All right. So, looking at Unit 2's key question number 22, vocabulary development. If you flip through your unit, you'll see a glossary. And a glossary, it just means a collection of words. And so it's a list of words that are taken from Where the Rivers Meet. And you'll notice that the page on which each word is found is given for your convenience. So when you look at the word, it'll say page 6. You go to page 6, you're going to find that word. And then the glossary on page 23 actually shows you the meaning of each word. So remember, any word can have more than one meaning. As you examine each word, think about the context in which it's used in the story. Then you choose any 10 of the words listed below and write sentences of your own to show your understanding of them. You will be writing in 10 full sentences. Okay? So up on the board, I've listed the words that we found in chapters 1, 2, and 3. So in chapter 1, we have resonating, exasperation, gallantly. Chapter 2, we have impertinent, coward, insidious, insolence, lateral, contemplated, skeins, and oblivious. Chapter 3, we have viable, reproachful, emanating, and exorbitant. Exorbitant. Yeah, so these are what I call $10 words, and the level of words used in this book is quite high. I think that that's a literary phrase we call diction. So your level of diction is basically how fancy your words are, right? Like how hard the words you're speaking are for others to understand what they mean. So you may not have heard these words, but we're practicing a reading strategy where you read the sentence that it's written in, and then you try to figure it out from there. Like for example, we've got insidious on page 8, and if I scan the book and I try to find the word, there we go. Quigley, this is her science teacher. Quigley was probably the most hated person at Creighton Secondary. It wasn't just that he ran the dullest classroom in the school, or even that he was nasty to the point of being cruel. There was something even more insidious about the man. So from context, you can tell here that insidious is not a positive thing. And so something even more insidious, right? So we've just said that he's nasty to the point of being cruel, right? But she's saying it's more insidious than that, right? So that gives you a pretty good indication of what the word means, And so it's good to get the definition of a word through context and just do your best to figure out what you think that word really means. But if you go to the glossary of words at the back and you look up the word insidious, you will see that, let's see, I'm just trying to find it on my sheet, and it's an adjective, and it means spreading or developing with harmful effect. Okay? So that's interesting, right? So my definition of insidious was a little bit off too, right? So spreading or developing with harmful effect. Okay, so let's see if we go back to page 8 where we found that word. There was something even more insidious about the man. All right, so it's sort of like a nastiness, a meanness, a cruelness, but it's also sort of like spreading out and affecting other people. So yeah, it seems like a pretty good choice right there. So you've got to, pick the word, and then you can do the ones you're most familiar with. That's fine. But I encourage you to pick some words that you don't know. Pick them out of there, and then, try to use one in your own sentence. So, for example, I've got amnesty, ashrain, insidious, perilously, wavering, vocational, solace, skeins, right? So just follow that example. You've got to pick 10 of them and write a sentence for each one, right? So, the evil villain, had insidious plans for the city. I don't know, something like that, right? So now that I know what it is, I can use it in a sentence. So I know it means, doing harm to other people, kind of like ill intent, spreading out to other people. Key question 23 is these are your guided reading questions. So I won't tell you the answers, but you just simply have to go there and say, what is the setting for this novel? You should be able to answer that quite easily. What is Nancy Antoine doing at the beginning of the story? What First Nation does her people belong to? Toward the end of the chapter, Nancy asks George, when are we going to get out of here? I want to leave this place. Why does she ask this? So some of the guided reading questions are very straightforward. They're very simple. It's, basically just seeing that you've read the book. But some questions, like number 4 here, are asking you a little bit deeper. So you have to explore that a little bit deeper. Why would she say this? Why would she say, when are we getting out of here? I want to leave this place. So why does she ask this question? Describe the local school as Nancy views it. Again, wherever possible, I'm hoping you can quote from the text. Cite examples. Right? Or you can just simply paraphrase, right? But again, use the source text. What is the name of her school? Who is Donut Stevenson? Why is she usually upset with Nancy? Chapter 3, what example is given at the beginning of this chapter of a difference between native and non-native people? Who is Simon Grebs? What does he have in common with Larry Mills, the local hotel and pub owner? Barry Paul is a friend of Nancy. Describe his character. Barry sees himself as an entrepreneurial sort of guy, a small businessman. So if you've read that chapter 3, and paid attention, you'll know exactly why he thinks of himself as a businessman. It's a pretty funny reason. All right. Excuse me. So that is all the time we have for today. I see that I got about a minute left here, but but just a brief discussion on these chapter reflections, right? So when you write a chapter reflection, just keep in mind this is a huge part of your grade. You've got to write. You have to write on any 6 chapters, but each one has to be 5 sentences long. Okay, so you got to write a paragraph for every chapter you write about. And when you write about the chapter, you're going to want to use those elements of narrative and focus on things like, characters, narrative, plot, conflict. Focus on those things to help you guide your writing. Okay, that's all the time we got for today. Thanks for tuning in. We will see you tomorrow.